This part of the video discusses how PPROI software relates to the development of economic science. By doing this, we are building on the substantive and mathematical characterization of the brand new PPROI information presented in the previous sections of the video. This, the longest section of the entire video, is divided into 3 parts. In this part 3.1, we first discuss the 2 types of scientific development, evolution and revolution. Paying closer attention to the latter, we have labeled PPROI software a scientific revolution because it fundamentally changes the way the economy is managed at its most basic and decisive level. Since this primarily concerns economic theory, we have attempted to send the gradually compiled parts of the video to many academics involved in the relevant field for assessment. This subsection summarizes the responses received to date. A claim of a revolution in economic science requires an examination of its foundations. These foundations are undoubtedly contained in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We are paying special attention to this text because it emphasizes the importance of the profit-to-capital employed ratio and the need to reflect this in product pricing. However, Smith failed to do so in his example for several reasons, which we will discuss. Subsequent theory and practice completely neglected this crucial requirement. It was not until more than 200 years later that Smith's concept was first implemented in PPROI. Part 3.2 provides a more detailed explanation of the unique features of the PPROI software and how they were developed. First, the indivisibility of logic, mathematics, and digitization in software development is commented on. Attention is then paid to the definition and characteristics of basic financial variables, especially the dependence of their values on the definition of the enterprise, the relationships between money and time, the impact of different types of resources on the capital employed, and costs, the division of variable values into directly calculated and allocated, and some other properties of PPROI software variables are explained. The circumstances in which PPROI was created and the people involved are also mentioned. Part 3.3 is the final part of Section 3 and provides a chronological overview of the economic theories that followed Adam Smith and had a significant impact on economic practice. The names of the respective authors are also listed. These theories and practices are assessed from the perspective of PPROI. Science is a pivot of human knowledge. Its fundamental objective is to discover and describe the regular properties of existing phenomena, while also providing guidelines for applying this knowledge. The development of science is of 2 kinds, evolutionary and revolutionary. Evolution in science builds on existing knowledge, extending and deepening it within the relevant field. It is an ongoing process. Scientific revolution involves groundbreaking knowledge that rejects previous knowledge at its very foundation. This can happen when previous scientific statements are based on a superficial understanding of the issue and are not proven. If these statements seem obvious to the public, they become false axioms. Therefore, revolutionary scientific insights may initially be met with widespread resistance and must be proven beyond doubt. If that comes to pass, then the new statements should be generally accepted, and no further scientific revolution should occur in the given topic. The next stage in the scientific development of the topic should be evolutionary. A correct verbal statement is not enough. Even in economics, the importance of expressing phenomena numerically is emphasized, and Lord Kelvin is often quoted in this context. We did the same in the previous section of the video. However, logically justified verbal statements are a necessary basis for scientific correctness. Measuring erroneous hypotheses only conceals and perpetuates scientific fallacies. This can also be demonstrated by Lord Kelvin's statements, some of which are debatable or demonstrably incorrect and have hindered the development of science. In 1895, Kelvin famously declared that heavier-than-air flying machines are impossible. This statement by the esteemed scientist confirmed the prevailing opinion that was widely accepted at the time as an axiom. But mere 8 years later, on December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers' flyer, powered by a gasoline-fueled 4-cylinder engine and piloted by Orville Wright, flew 120 feet in 12 seconds. Later that day, it flew 852 feet in 59 seconds. Kelvin's statement was proven false. It was one of the most significant scientific revolutions in human history. Compared to this moment, subsequent developments in aviation can be considered evolutionary. Kelvin's claim that heavier-than-air objects cannot fly is illogical, as even birds are heavier than air. However, designing the first aircraft required complex mathematical calculations, particularly with regard to aerodynamics. This case exemplifies the proper development of science in general, which is based on sound logic that should be correctly translated into mathematics. These developmental steps overlap. Authors of logical statements should understand how to express them mathematically. The photograph of Albert Einstein at the school blackboard illustrates the crucial role of mathematics in science. However, this is not basic algebra, which was used in economics by scientific management, a concept that emerged in the early 1900s. The sketch of the horizontal and vertical axes on the board shows how the variables are expressed in mathematical function displays. This is also essential for expressing economic variables and their relationships. So it is in PPROI, as demonstrated many times in previous sections of the video, with images of capital employed components measured by a definite integral. The scientific revolution in physics, as demonstrated by the flyer flight, is undeniable, and any opposition to it is futile. However, PPROI's revolutionary procedures are not obvious at first glance. They are incomprehensible to most people, who will almost certainly reject a potential PPROI offer. The almost certain resistance of ERP stakeholders has already been mentioned in the prologue to this video. Who within a particular ERP vendor's company would take responsibility for conceptual changes to the system whose description of manufacturing processes by products originated more than 100 years ago and is still in use worldwide? Initially, our communication with some ERP vendors showed promise, but they did not follow up. Efforts to generate interest in PPROI among practicing managers also proved unsuccessful. Even the PPROI appreciation and support for its dissemination by the EU and Czech Republic authorities did not help. This is particularly true because PPROI procedures conflict with managers' previous education. A general welcome for the PPROI concept we did not expect even from academics in business schools directly concerned with the issue. By refusing to minimize costs and/or maximize the profitability of products, the entire teaching of management based on these axioms collapses. However, to ignore demonstrably correct revolutionary changes in scientific knowledge is to deliberately continue to teach fallacies, which is the worst thing that can happen in any educational institution. Thus, the acceptance of PPROI hinges on the opinions of experts, particularly academics specializing in the relevant theory and teaching. As the basic conceptual characteristics of PPROI were outlined in the prologue, we sent it to academics from various countries who were available to us via LinkedIn in April 2025. We then sent out the remaining 2 sections of the video which had been prepared in stages. By the end of September 2025, we had received 126 responses from various experts. Of these, 119 were clearly positive. These responses came from the locations around the world shown on the map at the start of this section. Of the remaining 7 respondents, 5 questioned the importance of solving the problem rather than the solution itself, and 2 respondents said that this is nothing new to them as they already teach it. They highlighted the difficulty of calculating capital employed per product when companies manufacture multiple products. Most of the responses came from the USA and India, primarily from young academics. However, the first response came from Mahmoud Nourayi, emeritus professor of accounting from the USA, who offered to be quoted. "I do agree with the arguments about more disaggregated and more complete measurements. With advances in computational power, incorporating all relevant variables in the evaluation of product process is logically sound. We consider this opinion particularly noteworthy because it indirectly highlights the consistency of PPROI with the general trend in contemporary science across all fields, thanks to advances in computer science and technology." Abhishek Tripathi, an assistant professor of accounting and finance from India, Express the fundamental contribution of PPROI from another perspective in the following words. Your concept naturally aligns operational decisions with shareholder value, a core principle of modern financial management. Professor Divyesh Patel, who is also from India, recommended presenting PPROI innovations in the form of a comparative table. He designed one himself with the following columns. 1. Theme innovation. 2. Current practice. 3. PPROI. 4. Justification. And 5. Broader value. He also completed these columns to illustrate the benefits of PPROI from his perspective. Comprehensive and detailed positive feedback on the content of the previous video sections we received from Joaquin Obando Rivero, Professor of Finance and Accounting from Spain, also in terms of teaching. It's very encouraging to see how far you've taken this issue, not just conceptually but also with a working demo version of the system. I think it's a great idea to have an academic-oriented version that could be used in teaching. All respondents who answered positively appreciated 2 attributes of PPROI unanimously. The first was the quantification of capital employed in processes by product. The second was a new method of calculating product costs. We had more detailed conversations with some of the respondents. In Part 3.2 of this video section, we will address some of their questions and comments that may be of interest to everyone. The key factor, and the most surprising one for us, is clearly the positive reception of the PPROI, based on previous parts of the video, by a sufficiently large sample of academics with whom we had no prior connection. The positive views of academics on PPROI and their interest in participating in the issue are the fundamental prerequisite for the practical implementation of PPROI, because, as the saying goes, correct theory is the greatest aid to practice. The foundations of economic science were laid by Adam Smith in his famous Wealth of Nations by describing the attributes of the Industrial Revolution, although he did not use the term science there. The natural basic concept of managing the economy at both company and product level, according to the ratio of profit-capital employed, is already emphasized in this text. In previous sections of the video, we explained this concept and its implementation without mentioning Adam Smith, because we wanted to avoid replacing logical arguments with appeals to authority. We also wanted to anticipate the objection that industrial enterprises have changed since Smith's time, meaning some of his observations are now outdated or irrelevant. On the other hand, there is a prevailing opinion that Smith's core assertions are indisputable and have been adopted by subsequent economic theory. However, neither of these is true. Some of Smith's claims are contradictory, so not all of them can be correct. And Smith's key correct assertion, that the source of profit is the capital employed, and that the desired value of the profit-to-capital ratio for the entire factory can only be achieved by incorporating this ratio into product pricing, is overlooked even by contemporary economic theory and practice. However, even Smith himself failed to achieve this intention in the specific example of pricing 2 products. As this is a key problem in the management of the entire economy, we will comment on Smith's text in more detail. Smith discusses the capital employed in the sense of stock and its structure in Book 2 of Wealth of Nations. Here, he distinguishes between fixed and circulating capital, which he characterizes as follows. Fixed capital characteristic is that it affords revenue or profit without circulating or changing masters. As first specific items of fixed capital, Smith lists machines and instruments of trade, which facilitates and abridge labor. The second type of fixed capital is buildings. As the third type of fixed capital, Smith lists resources spent on land to improve its properties, such as clearing, draining, etc. As the fourth type of fixed capital, Smith considers the useful abilities of inhabitants acquired by schools, study, or apprenticeships. The characteristic of circulating capital is that it affords revenue only by circulating and changing masters. Even for circulating capital, Smith distinguishes 4 types. The first type is money, which facilitates the circulation and distribution of the other three types. The second type consists of stocks of items produced in agriculture. The third type is materials, whether altogether rude or more or less manufactured. The fourth type is finished articles, at merchants or manufacturers. Smith also emphasizes the connection between fixed and circulating capital, noting that some items of circulating capital become fixed capital, and that fixed capital cannot yield revenue without circulating capital. Regarding the last statement, we consider it necessary to mention the opposite connection. Without the instruments facilitating labor, listed by Smith as components of fixed capital, items of circulating capital cannot be produced. The above is how Smith characterizes capital employed in general. However, this is not reflected in the price calculation example, creating a contradiction between the declared key concept of product pricing and its implementation. Product pricing is addressed in Chapter 6 of Book 1, titled Of the Component Parts of the Price of Commodities. In this context, Smith emphasizes that the owner of capital demands a regular rate of profit on capital employed, regardless of the product's wage costs. Smith illustrates this by calculating the prices of two products produced by two undertakers. Both employ 20 workmen, who are each paid $15 per year. This amounts to a total of $300. The first undertaker manufactures a product from coarse material that costs $1,000 per year, while the second undertaker manufactures a similar product, but from finer material that costs $7,300 per year. With the same wages, also all other characteristics related to both products, with the exception of material, are implicitly assumed to be the same. Smith calculates the annual profits for the first and second undertakers to be $100 and $730 respectively, with a profit rate on capital employed of 10%. This means 7.3 times higher profit per unit of commodity produced from finer material. However, the example does not include the specific numbers of yearly products or their prices. In this example, Smith equates capital employed with material costs. This fundamentally contradicts the general characteristics of capital employed described above. Firstly, in the example, Smith completely disregards the fixed capital employed in producing both products. If the fixed capital is the same for both products, then the difference in their respective profits should be much lower than calculated. Furthermore, neither material costs characterize the stock of circulating capital. These are two entirely distinct variables. Perhaps the contradiction between Smith's general definition of terms and the specific example can be explained by considering that the example was written in the first book of The Wealth of Nations, long before the terms were defined in the second book. However, even if in this example Smith attempted to capture all items of capital employed, he would not succeed unless he used a definite integral to measure them. This method of measurement is not mentioned in The Wealth of Nations. Instead of attempting to implement Smith's correctly worded revolutionary concept of using capital employed at the product level, particularly in pricing, subsequent economic theory has neglected this fundamental issue for over 200 years. Compared to Smith's concept, economic theories and practices relating to the management of products, their processes and resources according to costs can be characterized as a scientific counter-revolution that has continued into the third millennium. A systematic solution to the problem was only developed at the first decade of 2000s in PPROI software. Smith's revolutionary concept of managing the economy at its most basic level, according to the profit-to-capital ratio, has been implemented. His vision has become a reality. In light of the above-mentioned overwhelmingly positive response from dozens of academics around the world, we believe that this revolutionary change will spread quickly. Traditional presentations of the attributes of the Industrial Revolution often omit the profit-to-capital employed ratio. And this is not the only issue addressed by Smith in The Wealth of Nations. The main breakthroughs of the Industrial Revolution, compared to previous craft production methods, are seen in the deep division of labor and mass production in factories equipped with machinery. Together, these factors dramatically increased previous labor productivity. The division of labor Smith discusses as the main factor in the growth of productive power of labor as early as Chapter 1. Because this text is also relevant to subsequent economic theory up to the present day, we will discuss it here too. As an example, Smith presents the process of manufacturing a pin, which involves 18 separate operations. Smith observes that, in large manufacturing facilities, each operation is carried out by a different person, whereas in smaller ones, one person may perform 2 or 3 operations. Numerically, Smith mentions the production of pins by 10 workmen who produce 48,000 pins per day, or 4,800 per workman. This is far more than a single, non-specialized person could produce. The cost of the product, which was then called a commodity, included the price of the materials purchased, such as wire, and the labor costs, expressed by wages. This covered not only the workmen, but also the labor of inspection and direction. However, Smith does not take into account the costs generated by machines and instruments, as well as buildings in which manufacturing processes for specific products take place. Thus, Smith disregards these resources not only in terms of capital employed, but also in terms of costs. The same is still largely true of current theory and practice. The varying numbers of workmen involved in the pin-making process mentioned by Smith cannot be overlooked either. Labor productivity can remain the same if the production of pins is divided between 10 and 18 workmen. If 10 workmen produce 48,000 pins per day, then 18 workmen can produce 86,400. In both cases, there are 4,800 pins per one workman. However, this may not be the case. Smith does not comment on this. Clearly, the time taken to produce one pin varies depending on how many workmen are involved in the process. The more workmen involved, the shorter the production time for each piece. However, the capacity of the machine or instrument forming the bottleneck of the process is the constraint on increasing the number of workmen that can be employed to reduce the processing time per piece. This limit can be increased by adding an additional such machine or instrument to the process. This has financial implications. The more pins are produced daily on a given machines and instruments, the lower the fixed and circulating capital employed per pin, and the lower the fixed and total costs per pin generated by machines, instruments, and buildings. To conclude our commentary on the points in the Wealth of Nations that we consider key, we comment on the ratio of profit to capital employed as a criterion that Smith linked to the Industrial Revolution. The construction of buildings and the purchase of factory machinery require large sums of money that are tied up for the duration of the physical asset's existence. The owners of this capital in its physical forms demanded a return on it, similar to that from money loans. However, the need for a reasonable return on the financial value of physical resources has been linked to the origin of money, and since then, it is timeless. So this has been relevant even before the Industrial Revolution, although it wasn't so obvious at the time. This applies to all sectors of the real economy, not just manufacturing, and to all forms of asset ownership, including state ownership. This is valid in general as this is basic law of economics given by nature.